Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today is German Unity Day, and therefore I thought it would be a good day to show you a timeline of German political parties, starting with the Unification of Germany in 1871, proceeding through the Weimar and Nazi periods, and then finally ending up with the main parties as they exist today. Previously, I've done similar videos for both Canada and the UK, so if you're interested in watching either of those, I'll leave the links in the description. Take note that the UK timeline is still available as a limited edition wall chart. Okay, so Germany has a very long history, going back much farther than 1871. It's just that previous to this, the area went by other names, most notably the Holy Roman Empire, from 962 to 1806. But you see, the Holy Roman Empire didn't have any political parties, at least not in the modern sense. Instead, it was a collection of mostly small, independent monarchies, ruled by dukes, counts, and princes, with an emperor presiding over the whole thing. However, during the Napoleonic Wars, the empire crumbled. So for most of the 1800s, the German states were in a state of flux. Then, in 1848, revolution broke out, fueled by the people's desire for a new unified German state, this time one based on democratic principles. That revolution failed, but it did mark an important turning point, and by 1871, a new unified state was in fact created, the German Empire, and it did have some democratic features. Wilhelm I, previously only King of Prussia, became the first German emperor. Otto von Bismarck, previously Minister-President of Prussia, became the first chancellor. And elections were held to select the first members of the Reichstag, or parliament. Now, the first thing you need to note is that while the Reichstag members were associated with various political parties, the chancellor was not, nor was he elected. He was simply appointed by the emperor and then served as an independent. He then appointed the members of his executive cabinet, who were also often independents. Thus, during the imperial period, no German political party actually held power in the way that they do today. That said, I do want to introduce you to the main parties that existed during that period, as they played an important role in the formation of later parties. Initially, the largest party in the Reichstag was the National Liberal Party, or NLP, shown in green. For the first 10 years, they supported Bismarck, which is why I show them above this line here. This line is important because throughout this entire chart, parties shown above the line are those that either help form the government or are at least strongly aligned with the government, whereas parties shown below are those that are in opposition. Now, when it comes to the National Liberal Party, it's important to note that the word liberal in their name does not mean the same thing that it does today in, say, an American context. You see, nowadays, liberals are usually associated with the political left, but originally, a liberal was simply anyone who supported things like democracy, property rights, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and in the case of the NLP, free trade. But you see, in 1873, just 2 years after the formation of the German Empire, an economic depression started in Europe. In fact, it was called the Great Depression, up until the even Greater Depression in the 1930s. Because of this, starting around 1881, Bismarck abandoned his alliance with the NLP and started to promote protectionism, aligning himself instead with the two main conservative parties. These were the German Conservative Party, which consisted mainly of wealthy nobles, as well as the German Reich Party, which consisted mainly of wealthy business magnates. This new alliance between the Chancellor and the Conservatives would remain until the end of World War I. Now, another major party during the imperial period was the Center Party, or in German, Zentrum, which is why it is abbreviated with a Z or Z. But again, don't assume that this means that the party was centrist in the modern sense of the term. It was actually mostly right-leaning and was only named the Center Party because it was made up of Catholics. And in the Imperial Reichstag, the Catholics sat in the center, between the Protestant conservatives and the Protestant liberals. Anyhow, the Center Party is important because it was basically the forerunner of the current Christian Democratic Union, which is one of the two main parties in Germany today. The other main party today, the Social Democratic Party, or SPD based on the German, also got its start during the imperial period, being officially founded in 1875 when two worker-based parties united. It was quickly made illegal, though, due to fears that its socialist ideas would start a revolution. However, in 1890, it was made legal again, and this time the party adopted an even more explicitly Marxist agenda, although this was later softened as the decades went by. Finally, there was also the left-leaning Progress Party, which fits somewhere in between the NLP and the SPD. In 1884, it merged with a breakoff group from the NLP to form the Free-Minded Party, which eventually became the Free-Minded People's Party, which eventually became the Progressive People's Party, which eventually became the German Democratic Party, or DDP. So yeah, a lot of name changing there. Now, by 1912, it was the SPD that was the most popular party in Germany, but due to how the political system worked, it, like all parties, didn't hold any actual power. But then, of course, World War I broke out, and everything changed. In the final weeks of the war, when it became clear that Germany would lose, a peaceful revolution took place. The emperor, as well as all of the other nobles, abdicated, and the final imperial chancellor, Max von Baden, passed his title on to the leader of the largest party in parliament, which was Friedrich Ebert of the SPD. But then things did get a bit violent because a radical breakoff group from the SPD wanted to set up Soviet-style councils instead of having a parliamentary system. In the end, the parliamentary side won, and in January of 1919, the first ever election in Germany with universal suffrage was held. The SPD got the most votes, so Friedrich Ebert went from chancellor to president, which was a new title that replaced emperor as head of state. Another SPD leader, Philipp Scheidemann, then became chancellor, serving as head of government. However, the SPD did not have enough seats to form a majority, and therefore they had to form a government with the help of the Center Party and the DDP, which actually worked well because it was these three parties who were the most dedicated to the idea of creating a new parliamentary republic. Because of the potential for street rioting in Berlin, the new parliament initially met in the city of Weimar, which was associated with culture rather than militarism. It was there that the new constitution was written, which is why the subsequent period became known as the Weimar Republic. But take note that Weimar did not become the new capital, because the Reichstag did move back to Berlin a year later. Now, before I move on, I want to point out that Useful Charts has available, for the first time ever, several non-English wall charts, including one in German. Basically, this chart is exactly the same as our best-selling Timeline of World History, only the text is in German. We also have the same chart available in French and in Spanish. So if you're interested in buying any of these, you can head over to usefulcharts.com right now by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. Now back to Weimar Germany. As you can see, the Weimar period was very unstable, with the role of chancellor constantly changing hands, and several parties, particularly the SPD, constantly coming into and out of government. President Ebert, however, served until his death in 1925. At this point, a special presidential election was held, and it was won by the independent candidate Paul von Hindenburg, who had been head of the German army during the second half of World War I. It was during his tenure that things took a turn towards the extreme right. To explain, I have to go back and show what happened to the two conservative parties after the fall of the empire. Well, they basically coalesced into the DNVP, or in English, the German National People's Party. It was mostly due to them that Hindenburg became president, although there was also the fact that the left split the vote with the increasingly popular Communist Party, or KPD. Over the next few years, the main Weimar parties tried to keep the communists out of government, but by doing so, they had to sometimes work with the DNVP. Then, in 1929, the Great Depression hit, And soon thereafter, Hindenburg and his appointed chancellors, two of whom were right-wing independents, started to rule by emergency decree rather than by the consent of the Reichstag. This period is known as the presidential cabinets, and it paved the way for the rise of Hitler. Now, Hitler's involvement in politics actually goes back to the early days of the Weimar Republic, when he basically took over an obscure party called the DAP and turned it into the Nazi Party, which was officially known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He chose that name very deliberately, using the words national and German to appeal to the right, and the words socialist and workers to appeal to the left. But make no mistake, the Nazis, despite their propaganda, were not socialists. They were fascists who wanted ultimate power and were willing to use any means to achieve it. Their first attempt to grab power took place in 1923, when they tried to take over the government in Munich, arguing that Germany had not really lost the war, but was rather stabbed in the back by the Social Democrats, and most notably by the Jews. This coup, however, failed, and is the reason why Hitler spent the next year in prison. After his release, though, he continued to build the Nazi Party, and in less than a decade, they were the largest party in the Reichstag. Again, this was due in part to the left being split between the more moderate SPD and the more radical Communist Party. In 1933, Hindenburg made Hitler chancellor, and a coalition was formed between the Nazis and the DNVP. Then, just 1 month later, the Reichstag was set on fire, perhaps by a lone arsonist, perhaps by communists plotting a coup, or perhaps by the Nazis themselves. This is all still debated. But the end result was that it gave the Nazis an excuse to pass the Reichstag Fire Decree, which took away most civil liberties, and then the Enabling Act, which gave the Nazis the power to make and enforce whatever laws they wanted to. Pretty soon, all other parties, including the DNVP, were made illegal, and anyone who posed a serious threat to Hitler was killed. The final step in Germany's transition from republic to dictatorship occurred when President Paul von Hindenburg died in 1934. At this point, the roles of president and chancellor were merged, and Hitler was thereafter referred to simply as the Führer, which is the German word for leader. Now, that's all I'm going to say about the Nazis, as I think they get enough attention on history channels as it is. So let's jump ahead to after World War II. For the first 4 years, Germany was controlled by the four main Allied powers. But you see, soon after World War II ended, a new war began, the Cold War, with the US, UK, and France on one side, and the Communist Soviet Union on the other. Thus, Germany ended up being split into two new countries, West Germany and East Germany. Since this chart only shows the political parties of West Germany, let me quickly tell you what happened in East Germany. Basically, in East Germany, the SPD and KPD merged to create the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. And since East Germany became a single-party communist state allied with the Soviet Union, this party was the only party until the dissolution of East Germany in 1990. However, in West Germany, a multi-party republic was re-established under a new constitution called the Basic Law, this time with the parliament being called the Bundestag. Both the SPD and the communist KPD were revived under their former names. The Center Party was as well, and still exists to this day. But the vast majority of its members, who remember were Catholics, founded a new party instead, together with socially conservative Protestants from other former parties. This new party was called the Christian Democratic Union, or CDU, although in Bavaria, a separate but allied party was formed called the Christian Social Union, or CSU. These two union parties won the most amount of seats in the first election, but not enough to form a majority. They therefore had to form a coalition with two other new parties. The main one was the FDP, or Free Democratic Party. It had been created by former members of both the DVP as well as the DDP. The other was the German Party, which was a monarchist party made up primarily of former DNVP members. It eventually dissolved in 1961. In 1949, Konrad Adenauer, being that he was the leader of the CDU, which was the largest party in the Bundestag, thus became West Germany's first chancellor. However, under the new and current constitution, German presidents are elected a bit differently. Basically, every member of the Bundestag gets to vote, as well as some special delegates from each state, based on proportional results. In the very first election, Theodor Heuss from the FDP was selected. This is because the FDP was a member of the ruling coalition, and all of the coalition members chose to support him. It's important to note, however, that under the new constitution, the German president does not actually hold much power and is mostly just a figurehead. It's the chancellor who is the primary leader of the country. The CDU remained the dominant party in West Germany for the first 20 years of its existence, during which time West Germany was able to quickly rebuild its economy. Take note that from this point forward, the years shown represent election years. The CDU always had to form coalitions, though, usually with the FDP, although take note that in 1953, this short-lived party was a part of the coalition as well. In English, it was known as the All-German Bloc, League of Expellees and Deprived of Rights. Basically, it represented those Germans who had been living outside of Germany during the war and had subsequently been expelled from those countries. In 1966, something interesting happened. There was a falling out between the CDU and the FDP over the budget, resulting in the CDU needing a new coalition partner in order to stay in power. Thus, Germany's first grand coalition was formed, meaning that the two largest parties, the CDU and the SPD, agreed to work together. However, at the next election, the SPD surpassed the CDU for the first time and was thus able to form their very first government, with Willy Brandt becoming chancellor. Take note, however, that because they still had less than 50% of the seats, they had to form a coalition with the FDP. As we'll see, no party has ever won a majority of seats in the Bundestag, and thus some sort of coalition has always been necessary. Willy Brandt is remembered primarily for two things. First, for opening up dialogue with East Germany, which became the first step towards eventual reunification. And second, for kneeling before this memorial to the 50,000 plus Jews killed as a result of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, something that was seen by many as a humble recognition of the evil Germany had done. Anyhow, the SPD remained in power until 1983, which is when the CDU came back under the leadership of Helmut Kohl. It was during his tenure that the infamous Berlin Wall fell, and shortly thereafter that East Germany was reunited with West Germany, exactly 35 years ago today. Let me take a moment to share with you how this occurred. You see, although Berlin was located in East Germany, the western half of the city was technically a part of West Germany, and a double wall was eventually built around it so that it remained separate, meaning that the only way to get from West Germany to West Berlin was by airplane. From 1961 to 1989, anyone who tried to cross the Berlin Wall was shot by East German guards, and in fact, around 140 people did die this way. In addition to this physical barrier in Berlin, there was also the Iron Curtain, which was not a single literal wall, but rather a mostly closed border that existed not only between West Germany and East Germany, but between all of Western Europe and all of the countries allied with the Soviet Union. The first step that eventually led to the fall of the Berlin Wall occurred in August of 1989, when Austria and Hungary agreed to ease restrictions along their border, thus creating a hole in the Iron Curtain. Over the next few months, thousands of East Germans used this border crossing to escape to West Germany. The result was that East Germany was pressured to come up with their own plan for eased restrictions. Then, on November the 9th, 1989, A mistake was made at an East German press conference, which seemed to indicate that East Germans were now free to cross the Berlin Wall at will. Crowds started to gather at the crossing, and eventually, after much confusion, people were in fact allowed to cross peacefully. The East Germans were welcomed by the West Germans, and pretty soon crowds were climbing up on the wall and starting to chip away at it. Less than a year later, Germany was officially reunited. One of the results of reunification was that the party that had formerly governed East Germany now entered the scene under the new name Party of Democratic Socialism, or PDS. In 2007, they merged with another left-wing party and rebranded as the Left. To date, they have never helped form government. Another more recent party is the Green Party, founded in the 1980s. They have helped form government, the first time being from 1998 to 2005, which is when Gerhard Schroeder of the SPD served as chancellor. The 2005 election was a very close one, with both the SPD and the CDU claiming victory. This resulted in there being three different possibilities in terms of a coalition. The first was that the CDU could govern with the help of the FDP and the Greens, something known as a Jamaica coalition, because the colors of the three parties would match those of the Jamaican flag. The second possibility was that the SPD could govern with the FDP and the Greens, something known as a traffic light coalition, because, well, the colors would match those of a traffic light. However, it was the third possibility that ended up being the one chosen, and that was another grand coalition, like the one back in the 1960s when the two big parties worked together. Being that the Union parties won a few more seats than the SPD, Angela Merkel, leader of the CDU, was named chancellor, becoming the first and so far only woman to hold that title. She ended up serving for 4 years, 3 of which were grand coalitions. In 2021, after Merkel's retirement, the SPD finally surpassed the Union parties in terms of seats, and thus their leader, Olaf Scholz, was able to form a traffic light coalition. This, however, did not last long, because in the next election, which was the most recent one held back in February, the Union parties came out on top again, meaning that, as of right now, Angela Merkel's replacement, Friedrich Merz, is chancellor. He was not, however, able to form a coalition with any of the smaller parties, so Germany right now has yet another grand coalition, the 5th so far. Also notable this past election was the second-place win by Alternative for Germany, or AfD, a new party that formed in 2017 as an alternative to the CDU. It is considered to be a far-right party with extremist views, and therefore its recent success has worried many people. Okay, so that was a look at the timeline of German political parties. Let me know in the comments what you think the future of German politics will hold. And don't forget that this timeline of UK political parties chart is still available as well, and that we now sell German, French, and Spanish versions of our timeline of world history. Thanks for watching.